Welcome to State of Reform's virtual leadership series with some of healthcare's most thoughtful leaders. And now, the host of State of Reform, DJ Wilson.
Senator, thanks for making time to be with us. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.
So maybe just start, tell me what it's like as a person, as a human, to be one of 100 as a US Senator leading during this time of great polarization. What's it like to be in politics these days?
Well, I can tell you the Senate is a very different place from the Senate I first saw when I was here as an intern in 1976, and then I worked for Congress in the 1980s. And what I saw then is amendments were common and blockades were rare, which meant it was a functioning legislative body. And the superpower of being a senator was that you had the ability to take any issue that you cared about or your constituents cared about and say, let's put it on the floor. Let's debate it as an amendment to a bill. And in so doing, not only did you get it debated, but the vote meant there was accountability on that issue to the people of the United States of America. Now amendments are extraordinarily rare. They're being completely blockaded by the leadership of the Senate. And so that whole system of being able to raise issues and have accountability with the people is deeply damaged. You also have this intense kind of tribal partisanship in which the chasm between the parties has gotten much, much larger. That's being reinforced by cable television, reinforced by social media. And so you have to work a lot harder to reach across the aisle and find partners. I have found partners on dozens of bills, but when things become nationalized, for example, immigration policy right now, once it's nationalized, then you can't get a partner across the aisle. Another area you can't get a partner is election integrity. So the For the People Act, which takes on gerrymandering, voter suppression, and dark money, has been basically nationalized by the president, and there you cannot get a partner across the aisle.
How much socializing do you do with other members of the Senate? It used to be, you mentioned 1976, it used to be that, the Senate at least did not have to go home every weekend and that you could get to know people personally and strike up personal relationships. Is that still a characteristic of the Senate?
Basically, much less so.
Yeah.
When I was elected, my family came to DC because I knew the old Senate, where the family's interconnections were a strong part of creating that collaborative body. But when my family was basically the only family here, after a year, they said, well, that's not working, so let's go back to Oregon. And it's just symptomatic of what has happened. Every lunch now, my colleagues across the aisle, every lunch, they have a partisan lunch. Democrats have 2 out of 3, so both parties are doing that. I've had a lot of ability to have breakfasts and dinners with colleagues across the aisle, and those are gone under COVID. Now I call and text my colleagues or meet with them on the floor. So there is still some opportunities to socialize, but it's really minimal compared to what it was before, and that does damage the body. When you don't know people well, when you haven't had casual moments with them, you haven't had some fun moments with them, it's just that much harder to work together.
How do you feel like, and this isn't, I told you, Senator, that I don't script these questions and that I'm responding to what you're hearing, and it dawns on me that that Oregon is not what has been portrayed. Portland is not necessarily what has been portrayed in the national media. How do you handle questions from your Senate colleagues about, boy, it must be terrible in Portland or it must be terrible in Oregon? How do you sort of represent the reality of what things have been like in the state versus what people see on television?
Yes, so we've received a lot of attention both about the confrontations in Portland and about the forest fires in our state. And I've had so many colleagues reach out to me and say, what do you need to help change that situation? And I raised for them the key parts of federal management of forests and about climate. And the response is, we see what's happening in California and Oregon and Washington. We're going to be ready to help. And I certainly hope they really are going to be ready to help because we need a lot more funds in that area. In regards to Portland, the reaction is much different depending on which party people come from. On one side of the aisle, people generally here in the Senate have seen the delegation of federal troops and the way that they were assigned to work as kind of a paramilitary secret police type operation that's totally inappropriate in a republic. On the other side of the aisle, because of the way it's been presented in their caucus or on cable television or in social media, they see it as, thanks to the president, we're taking on this rowdy, unacceptable situation in Portland. So it's a reflection of the fact that Americans and leaders in the Senate are living in different media worlds.
Yeah. So let's look ahead to January 3rd when Congress reconvenes and January 20th when the next presidential term is inaugurated. And let's imagine for a second that the polls today are all correct, which is that there's a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and perhaps a Democratic majority, but still a narrowly divided Senate. Where do you think the opportunities for meaningful progress exist in federal health policy in the first quarter or first half of 2021?
Yeah. DJ, the way that Democrats are looking at the possibility of the outcome that you just described, that is a blue Senate, a blue Oval Office, a blue House, is to think of that like a baseball analogy. Like that election, that's first base. You've gotten to first base, but you haven't scored any runs yet. Second base is unrigging the Senate. The Republican priorities in the Senate take 51 votes, or 50 plus a vice president. The Democratic priorities take 60 votes. So the Senate is fundamentally rigged against policies to invest in the American people, the ordinary people, in healthcare, housing, education, infrastructure, or to create equality of opportunity in civil rights or in LGBTQ rights or dreamers, or to take on climate. So that inequality in how the Senate operates, that rigged Senate, has to be unrigged. And that's a top priority in people's minds. That leads to another top priority, which is a sense of unrigging the following elections in terms of gerrymandering, voter suppression, and dark money. This then leads to the ability, hopefully an extended period, where we can do a lot better work on healthcare, for example. And that's why I wanted to give you that framing for it. On healthcare, there is unfinished business that has to be tended to, assuming we do not get another kind of hero-style bill done in the next few days. And so think about what was in the HEROES bill from the House that passed 4 months ago related to healthcare. It had a huge investment in testing and tracing. The Republican bill does not have that. It had federal Medicaid match rate increased to 14%. That is not the bill that exists on the other side of the aisle. It has community health center funding, and it has a special enrollment period for people to be able to sign up for insurance because so many people have lost their insurance through their workplace. It has state and local funding, which while it is not a permittable use to use it to do your Medicaid match, state budgets are fungible. So if you can have funds that help with public safety or transportation or other state functions, you'll have more money to help move into your Medicaid match. So there's a host of things that should have been addressed over the last 4 months that are very likely still going to be pending business. And so then kind of with the pandemic issues addressed, strengthening our hospitals, or particularly our rural hospitals, our clinics, strengthening the ability of states on Medicaid, and making sure vaccines are free for those on Medicare. There's a list of those things that are all the things that have been discussed that haven't been accomplished. Then we're turning in the next congressional session to issues like a public option. public option that was in the plan for the ACA, but was dropped on because we didn't have the votes. Basically, what it boils down to: you don't have the votes, you can't proceed. But I think people have a stronger sense of how important that could be. We have a public option in Oregon in our in basically our workplace workers' compensation program. And people don't even know it's a public option. It just sounds like an insurance company by another name. And that's the SAFE plan, State Accident Insurance Fund. It cut the cost in half in our state of SAFE or of workers' compensation. Rhode Island followed the Oregon model, and it cut their costs in half. So having a public option can be a big cost driver. Taking on the cost of drugs, real spreading concern, the fact that Americans pay so much more for drugs than do the citizens of any other developed country. And that just seems a bit outrageous given we invest more in the research that leads to these drugs than other countries. If anything, we should get the best cost, not the best price, not the worst price. Of course, these are highly contested ideas, but they are ideas that are on kind of the mind of folks about how we create a more cost-effective healthcare system.
So can Democrats expect to do any of this if the filibuster remains in place in your view? The
No.
60 vote requirement for cloture?
No, I do not think they can. I don't even know if they can do it if you do not have the 60 vote requirement, because certainly the drug industry would like to keep the pricing situation just the way it is. The insurance industry does not like the idea of a public option, and they're powerful actors that can put on major full court press, both in terms of influence directly on Capitol Hill, but also influence with American public with media campaigns. So there's a reason these things, while they're pretty have pretty common sense to it, and when you poll Americans are very supportive, there's a reason they haven't been done in the past, and those challenges will remain.
It seems to me that there's a divide. There's certainly, I think, unanimity amongst Democrats in your conference that healthcare is a priority, but there's a divide on the question of the filibuster between folks who've maybe been around for 25, 30 years and folks that maybe are newer to the Senate and institution. How are you finding those conversations with some of the more senior members who are slower to change, who maybe remember the days when the Senate was a better, more properly functioning institution? How are you finding conversations with them about changing the filibuster?
So you have a situation where those who were here decades ago saw a Senate where the use of the supermajority was rare. Never has it been deployed in the fashion in the 70s or 80s that it was deployed by Mitch McConnell in 2009, 2010. He used it as a full-on strategy of obstruction. It wasn't about compromise. It was not about better legislation. It was about paralyze the place. And so folks who have seen that abuse and who understand when it wasn't abused are pretty much prepared to say if we see a repetition of this abuse, then we have to end it. We've sat through that horror show once. We're not going to sit through it again. I do find it interesting because, having been here around the Senate in the 70s and 80s, ancient time ago, I saw the Senate when it functioned. Again, amendments were common and blockades were rare. If you're truly an institutionalist, you would want to get back to that. Remember that our founders wrote our Constitution in those years from 1781 through 1787, that 6-year period, when we had a constitution in place called the Articles of Confederation that required a supermajority to act, and it paralyzed Congress, or the Congress that was operating under the Articles. And so the founders wrote our Constitution for legislation to be a simple majority, and every single act that has ever passed in the history of our country has been a simple majority. But what evolved with this supermajority, or the filibuster, was essentially a strategy by white Southerners to block civil rights. For the 81 years before 1964, nothing was ever blocked except civil rights bills. So this is what this was about. And in the 1950s, the white Southern anti-civil rights group said, we can't sell this anymore. We need a better story. So they adopted the story that the supermajority was essentially about compromise and essentially about the First Amendment, and that it was kind of the founders' vision. Well, it wasn't about the First Amendment, it wasn't about compromise, and it wasn't the founders' vision. But that was a public relations campaign they employed to put a polite, acceptable story in the effort to block civil rights for Black Americans. If you're truly an institutionalist, you realize that a supermajority was opposed by the founders because they had direct experience with it, was not part of the design of the Constitution, and it was never, even though it slowly evolved as a courtesy to hear everyone's ideas before you vote, a courtesy is very different than a blockade. What we have is a deep freeze in the Senate that has to be fixed. And by the way, the Republicans have fixed it on their priorities. That's coming back to the point I made. Republican priorities, tax cuts for the rich, and proceeding to pack the courts are simple majority. If simple majority is good enough for Republican priorities, it should be good enough for Democratic priorities for the people.
You just made in your comments here, Senator, the most compelling case of anyone I've heard on this. So feather in your cap there, I think. Let me ask about, again, that potential Democratic Senate majority. It's reasonable to think that the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee will become the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. That would be Oregon Senator Ron Wyden. It's reasonable to think the ranking member in the Senate Health Committee would become the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee. That would be Washington State Senator Patty Murray. Both of those are the two central committees for healthcare reform in the Senate. Do you expect Washington, Oregon, the Pacific Northwest to perhaps have an outsized role in health reform moving forward into 2021?
Absolutely, for exactly the reasons you've just said. Yes.
Yeah. And does the CCO model from Oregon take something of a center stage, or how does the Oregon experience inform the federal conversation?
Well, Oregon has been a leader on healthcare in so many ways, so often that it often has produced ideas and kind of piloted strategies that have been looked at carefully by the rest of the nation. And I think that will certainly continue. In terms of whether or not you create a federal incentives for the CCO structure, it certainly has worked better than the Medicaid system in a lot of states. But there's always this tension between how much do you prescribe at the federal level and how much do you incentivize and how much do you just simply leave to the states while publicizing the different experiences. I think that's undetermined. I don't have a sense of that there's necessarily a high momentum to try to institutionalize that model across the country. Perhaps to incentivize it some, but I don't think there's a sense that it needs to be prescribed.
Senator, thank you very much for making time. This is a great conversation. US Senator Jeff Merkley, appreciate you being with us, sir.
You're so welcome, DJ. Thank you, and take care, and stay healthy.
Thanks for joining us in this virtual conversation and for your support of our work at State of Reform.